just before we start, a quick announcement. There are very, very few people now that we will be taking Kilkenomics out of Kilkenny for, but Naomi Klein is one. Naomi Klein burst on the scene many years ago, about 20 odd years ago. I interviewed her for a show I did called Agenda with a book called No Logo. She's had a series of books and documentaries over the past few years. Lots of you will know, for example, The Shock Doctor, and she is back. She has a new book out called Doppelganger, and I will be talking to Naomi on Friday, the 29th of September in the RDS in Dublin at 8 p.m. sharp. Early access tickets go on sale to Patreons. That's patreon.com/David McWilliams if you'd like to join us, or on general release on Monday. So that's me and Naomi Klein in the RDS, 29th of September, as part of our Kilkenomics Festival. See you there. To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Now, how are you doing there? It is time for the podcast. I hope all is well in your world. This podcast, we're going to continue our travels around Europe, looking at European countries, societies, economies, political structures, histories, all that good stuff. And we're going to the wonderful country of Portugal in a couple of minutes. One of the most fascinating economic histories out there. Really, really fascinating.
One of my faves, Mac, I have to say.
It's an amazing place.
I love Portugal. Yeah, absolutely. Particularly northern Portugal.
Well, I'm going to tell you a story about northern Portugal, but you were talking to me about social commentary there just before we came on.
Yeah, I'll get into trouble for this. But apparently there's a new thing that happens now.
Where does this happen, John?
This happens in people's houses. Let me get into it.
Okay.
But one of my girls, she had a Prosecco and painting party.
I hear.
Where a few of them come around to the house, they blaze into the Prosecco and they paint. Like they paint pictures. And it's great crack. They had great crack. But apparently one of them was saying to me, I love it. One of the local schools has, one of the parent council meetings or whatever, have turned it into Prosecco and prayer.
No.
That's the thing, apparently. Prosecco and prayer.
So this is kind of an iteration of water and wine at Mass.
Yeah, exactly.
It's exactly. You just neck the wine. So rather than painting, this is worthy of Ross O'Carroll Kelly. Actually, Paul Howard, if you are listening, there's your next week's column. Okay, Prosecco and painting, Prosecco and prayer, things that are happening in suburban Ireland, shit that you wouldn't believe.
Behind the twitching curtains. Yeah,
behind the twitching curtains. Now, it's funny you mentioned Porto, John. I'm going to tell you a story about Porto when the first or second time I was in Portugal. So it's 1990. It's a long, long time ago. And I'm in Lisbon and I go up to Porto. And Porto is a beautiful, beautiful town under the bridges there. You've been there.
Loads of bridges, yeah. It's fab. Really
There's all these little bars. There's all these little bars, little wine bars and everything. And then in 1990, it was a very, very different country. So, and back then I smoke fags. So I ran out of fags. So I said, and they sell smokes in different bars, right? And in the wine bars that I was sitting in, there were no fags. So I asked the geezer and he said, yeah, just around the corner, there's a big bar, there's a big cafe there, in there, and you get fags the back of the thing. I said, grand. So I walk in to the bar and I'm walking and it's a long, long, long sort of corridor. It's big, big place. So I'm walking down, there's tables on either side and there's a cackle of young, very, very attractive girls around this bloke. And I'm walking down and he looks at me and I look at him and I recognize him immediately as a bus driver from Dunleary, right? That's it, right? Do you remember, John, when the buses when they got rid of the bus conductors? He was a bus conductor, right?
Yeah.
And they got rid of the bus conductors in the late 1980s.
Yeah,
and they gave all the bus conductors. Yeah. They went to, so the bus conductor was a character. I don't know if you're a young listener, you won't get this idea, but the bus conductor was part of Dublin's social background noise. Fares, please, right? Yeah. So I look at your man, and he looks at me, and I look at him, and I know that he knows me, and he knows that I know him. And he walks up to me, he breaks away from this little group of very, very attractive young girls, and when I say young girls, young women, and he just walks up to me. And he walks straight past me, like in a Western, and he says, say fucking nothing. So, I'm thinking, okay.
The yarns he was spinning, I'd say.
Yeah, I don't know. So I go to the bar, and then he acknowledges me. Jesus, Macker, how you doing, right? And I say, how's it going? You know, his name is Joe. And I say, how's it going, Joe? And one of the young women says, how do you know Dr. Joe? I'm saying, Dr. fucking Joe? I say, I've known Dr. Joe for a long time. Right? I know Dr. Joe didn't do his intercert, right?
Yeah. Come on, Dr. Joe.
This fella, whose name will remain nameless because he could still be there, right, was teaching Anglo-Irish literature in the University of Porto. Right?
What? Really?
I swear to Jesus, right? Like, okay, he'd obviously fabricated everything, okay? And he was talking Joyce and Beckett and Yeats. And this was a cackle of his students around him who were like standing at the altar of wisdom. And these pearls coming from Dr. Joe, who I know was a bus conductor. Right?
That is fantastic.
Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? And we did a couple of scoops, and I just walked out, and I was just chuckling to myself. Dr. Joe, amazing analysis of, the influence of Anglo-Irish literature on this, that, and the other. And I'm looking and saying, you fucking spoofer, you spoofer.
A big set of cojones on him.
A big set of cojones on him. Anyway, there you go. That's my Portuguese story and Dr. Joe, the bus conductor. Big shout out to any bus conductors out there. It's a great yarn. And I hope you're still there. I hope you're still there teaching Anglo-Irish literature to another generation. So we're going to talk about Portugal this week, John, and I think we should go directly to an old mate of mine, Pedro Fonseca. Pedro Fonseca worked with me years and years ago, brilliant analyst, all around good laugh, really good fun guy. And as I think I said when we were chatting to him, John, top-rated analyst on Portugal in the city of London for years and years and years. So let's go to Lisbon. Now, as part of our summer tour around the world, well, certainly around Europe, and then last week, of course, we had to go to China to figure out what was going on in China, and then we're going to come back to China maybe in a day or two, talking about the new BRICS phenomenon down in South Africa that was happening just the last couple of days. But one country that has always intrigued me is the country of Portugal, and it's intrigued me for many, many years, mainly because when I studied in Belgium, I shared a house with 4 Portuguese lads. And I'd never met Portuguese people before. And we had such a total laugh. And the similarity with Irish people was just extraordinary. First of all, we were the 2 poorest countries in the EU at the time. We had no money. All the other students had great kit. And they had, some of them had like the cars and some of them had bikes and motorbikes and things. And the Portuguese and the Irish had actually nothing. And we were all there courtesy of a grant from the European Union. And we had a really good time. And then over the years, I've traveled all around Portugal, Alentejo, Évora, Monserrat, all these places, and of course, Lisbon. But I'm going to bring you back to the late 1990s. And I am in a place called Sintra. And I'm about to meet my next guest, Pedro Fonseca, an old mate of mine. One of the top, was the top-rated Portuguese analyst in the city of London for years and years and years, certainly late 90s, early 2000s. And I'm in Sintra on my holidays, and I'm meeting Pedro for a drink. So I meant to meet Pedro, and I keep phoning his phone, and he's not answering. He says, don't worry, call me, and we'll meet up in a bar. I'm phoning, and suddenly I get this kind of very muffled. And I say, Pedro, where are you? He says, man, I'm in the casino. I shouldn't be on the phone. I said, okay. He said, but I've just been kicked out. I said, why? He says, they've accused me of being a card counter. And here he is on the line from Portugal, the finest card counter in the casino in Estoril, Pedro Fonseca. Pedro, how are you, man?
Very, very good. There's easier way to make money than at the casino.
Well, I mean, you're now in Estoril, aren't you? So that's the casino central.
Yeah, I'm avoiding it though, the actual casino.
So what was happening? Was it the croupier? The croupier was accusing you of counting cards?
Yeah, some people came around and weren't too interested in me being a customer anymore.
Right, because you were winning?
I was winning, yes. And they thought I was doing some dodgy things with another guy was also on the phone. So.
Oh, so it was my phone call to you that prompted the act? I didn't realize.
Max. Jesus.
And I was winning, and they were thought, okay.
Yeah.
So I busted your flush. Yeah. I busted your winning streak.
I'm just on to my banker, mate.
All I was looking for was actually where was the best place for Vino Verde that night. You know, where was the best bar we were going to go? Restaurant.
It cost me some money.
Exactly. Listen, it's great to see you. So, Pedro, you're back in Portugal. You're in Estoril. Irish people are very, very close to Portugal, particularly those who play golf, go to Portugal a lot. Mm-hmm. I know lots of young Irish people have emigrated and resettled in Lisbon.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people have houses built around the Algarve. So that's the sort of one side of Portugal that we see. But give me a bit of context, the Portuguese economy, but particularly the history of the Portuguese economy first. Because when I was there years and years ago, Portuguese mates of mine, before I met you, Pedro, took me to Belém. And they took me to the monuments of the discoveries and the monuments of the Portuguese extraordinary expansion through the Atlantic and then, you know, into Asia, into Africa, into Latin America. Give us a sense of all that before we start.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I suppose due to the country's location, David, I mean, the country took a decision in the 1400s. Let's try to get to India. Let's, get our trade routes, avoid Venice, avoid Geneva, and let's do it. And the fact is they did it, and they opened huge amounts of markets. Also did their own damage as colonial invaders, as you can imagine, stumbled into the New World as well by finding Brazil. And it was a great mercantile country, in the 1500s, 1600s. Things were going quite well. We had a dynastic union with Spain, which didn't go too well for 60 years. We inherited a lot of their problems and enemies, such as the French, the Dutch. But at the end of the day, we had sort of the first mover advantage when it comes to opening up the world by the sea. But you had other bigger countries which came after us, the UK, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch. So we got squeezed out from a lot of places. Other places we kept. But I think the drama from Portugal is that particularly the 1800s weren't very good. We had a very tough Peninsular War against Napoleon. The British helped us, but at the end of the day, it was a lot of fighting, a lot of scorched earth policies in terms of the fighting. People think of it as the Russians were the first ones to do it against the Napoleons, but we did it a few years before. That's really quite tough. The Industrial Revolution, Portugal was not the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. We fell further behind. We got rid of our kingdom, our kings in 1910. That was nice. But we had a period of just ineffective republican democracies. A bit like Italy in the 1980s. We had a new government every 6 months. That wasn't good. And then finally we got Salazar afterwards. And this, that's very important because he was our fascist dictator and he ruled for almost 40 years. So the big part of what we are was shaped by him. So what did Salazar bring to the table? Well, for starters, we became a very inward-looking country. That's very interesting. You wouldn't think of Portuguese as inward-looking because
no, on the contrary, you think of Portuguese.
We're open to everybody. We've been head of a colonial empire for such a long time, but it was inward-looking precisely because we had delusions of a colonial empire.
Explain that to me.
Well, he used to put a map of Portugal with all our colonies superimposed on Europe and say, look how big we are. We had a saying which was proudly by ourselves. So as a way of keeping control, we're big enough, we don't need to be with all the dangers of interactions with other countries. We try to limit as much as possible. The problem is we were not much of a colonial empire. In terms of trade, that really hurt us. We try to be self-sufficient too many things. So we had an outsized agricultural segment. And what happened at the end of the day is we then got a colonial war in 1960. So that's costing us money. So if you look back where was Portugal in the 60s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, is that he did not want the country overly educated either because that's unstable. So you had a country which was undereducated, at war, with little freedom, it actually was not such a great place to be. And the truth is, you had huge amounts of immigration out of Portugal into other parts of the world for economic reasons, because people did not want to go to Africa to fight, all sorts of reasons. So that the story of Portugal is one of immigration to France, to Germany, to the US, even to Brazil. And then what we had a revolution in 1974, there were 3 Ds that people wanted, which was decolonization, democracy, and development.
Okay, so let's look. So the decolonization you're getting out of Mozambique and Angola, they're the two.
And Guinea-Bissau.
And Guinea-Bissau. So decolonization against Salazar, so democracy, and then this sort of maybe pro-European side of development. Let's join the West. Let's go back into the fold. Let's join the European Union, all that sort of stuff.
Even before that, this is 74, we joined, this is even before the EU, let's develop the economy. It became a poor country because it just wasn't very sustainable. But the other thing I should mention is the economic model in Portugal was corporativism, okay, not capitalism. So think of corporativism as a midway between socialism and capitalism. So the focus is not so much on an individual, you can have your own business, but on collective decisions. So there's like a top-down approach, not quite socialist, but not quite capitalism. That also was not a very good economic model either. When Portugal had the revolution in 1974, 35% of our population was in primary sector of the economy. Most developed countries in Europe were already in the single digits.
So what you're talking about is agriculture.
Agriculture, yes.
So 35% of everybody were farmers, small farmers. That's enormous.
It's enormous. So it was a poor country, but Salazar was happy because he had kept power.
And Pedro, was Salazar, is it fair to say he was kind of a Portuguese version of Franco? Or was he a Portuguese version of Mussolini? Or where's the comparison?
Okay, first of all, things like corporativism, it's very interesting you mentioned Mussolini, because Mussolini was one of the first guys to install it.
Yeah.
He was the equivalent of Franco in Spain. And in fact, he helped Franco keep out of World War II because as fascist leaders, they were theoretically closer to Hitler and Mussolini than anybody else. And in fact, Portugal participated in the Spanish Civil War, helping Franco. So if anything, Salazar helped Franco get into power. And politically, Spain always supported Portugal for that reason, because he was always grateful to what Salazar did. But yes, Franco was a fascist, Salazar was a fascist, and so was Mussolini. So, I think Salazar was shrewder than a Mussolini or even a Franco. He kept power for quite longer, but obviously it's not particularly good news. It also meant that Portugal, coming after fascist, by nature, is a left-leaning country. That's very important to understand. The Portuguese psyche is left-leaning.
Still now.
Still now. If you look at the two parties in power, fighting for power, one is the Socialist Party, the other one is Social Democrats. They both aim for the central stage, but always a little bit more left, if you understand. So it's variations on a similar theme, which in some ways you get some stability. You're not likely to get too much the kooks in power.
Yeah, swinging from side to side. Yeah.
So in the late 70s, so Portugal was a mess. And the first thing we had after the revolution was we had real left-leaning governments, and we had a nationalization program, which was nationalize all these businesses. And so much businessmen flew away from Portugal to Brazil and to other countries. So that was a mess. Decolonization in Portugal was done haphazard, not like the Commonwealth. We were the last country in Europe to decolonize, also very important. We should have done it before, obviously. And we had wars in all our colonies. It was all a big mess. And suddenly we had 1 million Portuguese, mostly white, but also black, returning to Portugal almost overnight. And that was 10-15% population increase overnight. There's not housing for everybody. So it's a real mess of a country. It's a beautiful country, but a lot of things going wrong. That's how it really was in the 70s. And that affects the Portuguese psyche, There's also a sense of resilience as well, because, been through so much hell. And then late 70s and early 80s, think about it. There were 2 global world recessions. That didn't help either. So things started getting noticeably better in the 80s. We had political stability. We started to reverse nationalization, and we joined the EU in 86. So that's when that really did help a lot. So that's the historical background a little bit, where the Portuguese are coming from.
It's funny you talk about the Portuguese psyche. What strikes people, a lot of visitors to Portugal, is that in contrast to their neighbors, Portuguese people seem to be much quieter, much more reserved. I remember being in a place called Montserrat, which is over in Alentejo.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Beautiful place up on a hill, right? And you're looking into Spain. And at night, you can hear Spain. It's loud, it's brash, the bars are open, the clubs are open. On the Portuguese side, it's quiet. It's quiet. Tell me about the psyche. Tell me something about the psyche, because it is a profoundly different psyche.
They are.
Yet you share the Iberian Peninsula for the last thousands of years.
We do. I think that we're definitely much less exuberant than the Spanish, without a doubt. I think maybe it's the sense that things have not gone so well for us for quite a while, It's tough, when you, for example, have a government for a long time undereducates people, you take a lot of the people's self-confidence, There's a lot, for a lot of Portuguese, there's not a lot to cheer about, for a long time. You can also say the Spanish had their troubles as well, and they have other issues in Spain, such as, internal divisions we don't have. So Portugal, in many ways, in that sense, we're more cohesive. I think maybe in Portugal, we also carry a little bit more the maybe Arabic influence of resigned to fate. Even that song music we have, Fado, which means fate. So it's sort of resigned to, we'll take what life has and we'll just keep going. But we're not going to celebrate all the time about it.
No, but it is. It's a total. And yet, as a result of the colonialization, as a result of the expansion in this 15th, 16th century, we get to a strange situation where Portugal, a country of 10 million people, is the home to the 5th largest language or most commonly spoken language in the world. I mean, that's an amazing footprint to have.
It is. And it's also interesting. We sometimes go to countries and people tell us about the influence, because for example, we were the first ones to go to Japan. So the Japanese always tell me, you guys brought us gunpowder from China. That changed our country completely. Or that, the word for bread in Japan is pan, comes from Portugal. So that's part of the heritage when we really were traveling around, opening doors everywhere. And that's a heritage. And of course, one of our colonies, ex-colonies, Brazil, ends up being a country of just over 200 million people. So that is part of the heritage. But, that's some of that is so far back now, David. I have focused on the more recent history because that's what hit our psyche. Fascist government, unnecessary wars is very tough. On the other hand, we do have a psyche of being, also the fact we traveled so much, of being open to different cultures, happy to speak English as a way to communicate with other people from other places. That's nice.
And that's also nice. The thing you notice the difference on the language issue, And again, I think Portugal has the oldest alliance with English. I think Portugal and England is the oldest alliance in Europe.
It is, that's true.
Which is what, back to the 13th century or something really, really ancient.
1380s, thereabouts, yes.
And you notice that again, Portuguese people linguistically are much, much more fluent in foreign languages than your Spanish cousins, for example, across the border. So on the one hand, you've got this internalization, Salazar turning the country in on itself, but yet the instinct seems to be to go out and travel. I remember years ago when we were living in London together, Goulburn Road, just up there in West London, full of Portuguese cafes, Little Lisboa, all those things. So the Portuguese footprint is enormous around the world.
It is, and because we also, if things aren't well, we don't have fear of packing up and going. So that's always been part of the Portuguese. The world is our oyster in that aspect, and we'll just go and do it. I think the language bit also is the realization that as a small country with an impossible language, we can't expect people to speak our language. It's a bit like a Dutchman and a German, right? A Dutchman will always speak English better than a German, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think in terms of language, this is a curious thing. In Portugal, we don't dub our TV.
That's hugely significant.
Huge. So we all know how Mr. T sounds,
Yeah, exactly. Pedro, let's fast forward, right? Let's fast forward to now. As I said at the top of the program, big Irish interest in Portugal for a variety of reasons. How are things going? How's the economy going in Portugal now? Because one of these very, very big Irish events, I think called Web Summit, moved lock, stock and barrel to Lisbon. Portuguese government has been very, very supportive of that. So I was told there's visas being given for tech entrepreneurs. There's been visas being given. What's happening in Portugal?
Well, first of all, I mean, despite everything, Lisbon and Portugal, it's actually quite a nice place to be in, actually. As you
it's
know,
an amazing city. It's an amazing city.
It's a lovely city, interesting. It was falling apart for many years due to rental rules, but otherwise, it's an interesting city, great weather, you're by the sea, good food, everybody speaks English. It's not hard to see why it's, it's popular. And yes, all these people coming into Portugal has been an important source of income. Now, first thing, let's talk about the challenge that Portugal has, Spain and Greece as well. Ireland, when you had your problems a few years ago, that was a different problem, even though it could always be part of the pigs and all that sort of stuff. The problem we have, of course, is competition, being competitive in a single currency. When you're a small country, you're a very open economy. That is still the number one challenge. When you're a small country, you're going to import a lot. And if you don't export to match it, you're in trouble. And Portugal really got into trouble, just like Spain and Greece. Huge current account deficits, completely unsustainable. And because you can't devalue the currency, you have to devalue the real economy. And that's always painful because, as you know, that means unemployment has to go up, wages have to go down, and you have to restructure the economy. Unlike the Greeks who tried to protest, got onto the streets, that's never going to help, right? We sort of, again, we resigned to our fate. We said, okay, we messed up. Now we have to fix the issue. And we did. But first of all, it's been a long, long adjustment. Okay. It's been 8, 9, 10 years of adjustment. It's not been fun. It's not been fun. So right now, in terms of trade deficits and so forth, we're stable. We're okay. But salaries have come down in real terms compared to the other countries. So the positive, you start seeing people investing in Portugal to take advantage of that. For example, the biggest bank in Portugal is now BNP Paribas.
An outfit that I landed in after UBS.
Yes, I
remember. God love them.
And they don't even do much lending in Portugal. It's just the back offices and other stuff. So you start seeing people taking advantage. Okay, low wages, a nice country to be in. Let's move there. So you do start seeing some companies, take advantage, as you expect when you rebalance your economy. That itself it makes sense. Because it's a pleasant place to be, Portugal has been positioning itself for the younger people, for technology, and that's also important. Now, people coming from abroad, having income from abroad and living in Portugal is a great idea, and that's what a lot of these digital nomads are doing. I don't know if we've reached a high water mark there, right? This may be starting, we've reached the top. We're going to have less and less of that in the future. That might happen. People coming from holidays, look, it's very trendy. Another high water mark may have been reached there. However, I think in terms of retirement, there's still room to go, right? It's still a cheap place to be. It's nice weather, and you're still going to get that.
So are you saying, Pedro, because what I noticed yesterday was we're looking at something on comparative rents. Rents in Portugal are rising much faster even than rents in Ireland. Yep. Rents in Lisbon. So how is that dislocating? Because the other thing I want to say is, okay, is the future of Portugal kind of like the Floridaization of Europe, that you're going to be what Florida is to northeastern United States, you are to Europe. We'll go on to that in a second. But just the dislocation of people are coming in, getting visas, rich people are allowed to come. The tax system is very beneficial for capital gains tax, as far as I remember. You don't pay capital gains tax if you...
No, it's not. We have a special taxation where... you pay less income tax and you pay no tax on dividends if you come from abroad.
So you're attracting in rich people.
Yep.
But of course, what that does is that drives up property prices and rents, and you squeeze out then the locals. And tell me that story.
Well, I think the average Portuguese is being squeezed on two fronts right now. And remember, the starting point from a country like Portugal is not a rich middle class, right? Yeah. Right. First of all, wages have not really grown anywhere. We're back to where we were 12, 13 years ago. So people are not feeling richer from a revenue point of view. And now we have high inflation, which is always a tax on the poorer people. So people are feeling the inflation. People are feeling the interest rates because Portugal, like Spain, like Italy, but unlike Germany, for example, we have variable rate mortgages. So people are really being squeezed there as well. And now you're being squeezed on the rents as well. So if you switch to rents, that's happening as well. So yes, I think there's a real squeeze there. The high prices in houses has meant a lot of people have become richer. A lot of people have moved to poor parts of Lisbon or the suburbs, but has allowed them to have some cash to spend. That has helped the economy, but that can't go on forever. But there's a dislocation. Society, there is a definite dislocation. A lot of neighborhoods now are becoming a lot of French, a lot of Irish, a lot of Americans. You see it. It's not 100% bad, but there is always that question, how long will this continue? Will Portugal 5 to 6 years from now do what Barcelona did, start telling people, back off?
Piss off.
Yeah, absolutely. But net, it's been a positive impact. It's a positive impact. I used to wonder at London, because I was there, I arrived there in 94, and I saw a lot of London change. A lot of places, you saw much less British people than in the past. I mean, I was living in Marylebone, which was American and French ghetto. And I thought, well, Portugal, at least we live in our own areas. And now it's also changing. So the difference between the average Portuguese and a foreigner in terms of money is greater than the average British person in London and a rich foreigner. So the potential for displacement is big and can continue.
Pedro, is there a divide between North and South Portugal? Like Lisbon and the Algarve compared to Porto and up the Silver Coast?
Northern Portugal was always a big area for industrialization. The area around Porto was a big industrial area. So Porto and Lisbon are both industrial areas. And people politically in Northern Portugal were traditionally more conservative and more Catholic. So when the fight back happened against the communists, it started from up north. So from up north, they're more conservative, more religious, but with a fair amount of industry. Algarve has never had anything else but tourism. And south of Lisbon is mostly agricultural. It's the poorest part of Portugal. But in general, Portugal is a relatively small country, relatively cohesive. People often overstate the difference between somebody from Lisbon and somebody from Porto. We're a lot more alike. Having said that, Porto is a lot cheaper than Lisbon, and you start seeing a lot of younger people going to Porto because it's better value for money. Because the whole thing of floridization, I think you're getting a bit of that, but you never know how far it's going to go. How big will it get? Will people go to Valencia next? What's the next?
Where's the next sort of place? Tell me, what's the relationship with Brazil? When we were hanging out together, myself and these Portuguese students, that's what they would tell us about Brazilian telenovelas and how Portuguese would sit in and watch these Brazilian soap operas and have Brazilian names like Kiki and Tiki and blah, 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 blah. What is the relationship between Brazil and Portugal?
Well, the Brazilian soap operas have been very professional for a very long time. And late 70s, early 80s, they were a staple of Portuguese TV because Portugal did not have the quality soap operas back then. So it was quite influenced. I think that the key thing about Brazil for us, is it is a very important source of labor. Because as Portugal salaries are still relatively low, a lot of the Portuguese are still immigrating abroad.
Right, so it's the same situation as Ireland. We have lots and lots of net immigration, but a huge amount of Irish, certainly graduates, are emigrating all the time, like tens of thousands every year.
Absolutely. The same happening in Portugal. They go to Germany, engineers and so forth. At the same time, as the hospitality sector has exploded in Portugal, you need people to do these jobs. And frankly speaking, without the Brazilians, Lisbon would not work.
Really?
Yes. A lot of the workforce in restaurants, hotels, even desk, front desk, whatever, a lot of them, huge amounts of Brazilians. There's probably now at least 400,000 Brazilians in Portugal, 4%, but I would imagine at least 200,000 last 4 or 5 years have arrived in Portugal. So we absolutely need them because, otherwise there'll be a lack of labor force. But in general, Brazil, I think, because it became independent from Portugal almost about 200 years ago, it's viewed as a brotherly country, not as some sort of ex-colony, and there's always a bit of that competition, a bit of, taking the mickey out of each other.
Yeah.
But, it's a very friendly relationship, because actually I often say Brazilians are like Portuguese people squared, i.e. they have their virtues and our negativism in excess. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
They're extreme Portuguese.
No, but it is true. You're right. I like the extreme Portuguese. So let's project forward, right? So if you look at, we're talking about over the last 100 years, distinct phases. You've got the Salazar phase of stagnation. Then you've kind of got the EU phase up until the 2008 crisis of optimism, growth, development, infrastructure. Then you got the 2008 crisis and the last 10 years, and everything has to be seen against the background of that. And now looking forward, you were talking about maybe, or I was just suggesting maybe the Floridaization or Miamiization of that part of the world where rich Europeans go there to retire, which you're definitely seeing that as a process. But the way in which, let's say, for example, Ireland transformed itself in the same period from a very backward, poor country, possibly poorer than yourselves in the 1970s, or certainly knocking around there, into quite a wealthy country. Is there any prospect of Portugal doing something similar, becoming a multinational hub or something similar to that there's a trick that the Portuguese are about to adapt that will propel the economy forward? Or do you think it's going to be much more slowly?
Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet, but some of the sort of the schemes, the ideas are the technology angle. Trying to make it an IT hub because all these IT people want to live in a sexy city, and Lisbon is a sexy city, so that's the whole projection. But it's a tough world out there right now. It's good enough that at least we've stabilized our external balances, but I don't think it's that easy. There are structural issues in Portugal must do, rather than kid ourselves. And I'll give you examples. We need to make further changes in our labor laws, make it more flexible. We need to get our court system working better with writing some of the rules so things can be more pragmatic. Portuguese, often we do lack a bit of pragmatism. We have to have a society with a little bit less empathy and more pragmatism. Okay, Portugal, like a lot of Latin societies, is heavy on empathy. And too much empathy sometimes is not a good thing.
Oh, that's not a bad thing. It makes for a nice place.
It does. But yeah. And we have to work things out like meritocracies. We need to do that a bit better. So these are boring stories, David, but this is the nuts and bolts that gets a country up and going, right? As long as we don't fix these problems, there's a cost, right? It's a cost if the labor laws are tough. It's a cost if the legal system is slow. All the stuff is sort of real. And we need to sort this out, actually. This is serious stuff because never forget, when you're a small country with an open economy, in a currency you can't devalue, you're always going to be vulnerable. You have to remain stressed if you're in charge. You can't get too diluted because that's what Portugal, Spain did and Greece did during 6-7 years where we run up huge external deficits thinking that somehow it would sort itself out, miracle.
And it didn't happen.
Nope, not at all. And to be honest, we could go back and get in trouble if not careful. It's very tough out there. It's a tough world. Globalization is wonderful, but it has a downside. And I'm completely pro globalization, but it's a responsibility if you're in charge. You can't let your country impoverish like they did in the run up to the crisis, because the country, on a relative basis to other European countries, has become more impoverished. And let me go on the thing is right now, because asset prices have gone up, there's a lot of people feeling rich. But revenue-wise, a lot of people are not feeling that rich. And particularly it's the younger people, because always the younger people get screwed, right?
It's a really good place to end, Pedro, because it will resonate a lot with a lot of listeners, particularly Irish people and Irish people living abroad, is this bizarre situation that's very, very similar to Portugal, is asset prices have got up. So those people with assets feel wealthy and they are much wealthier. But the young don't have those assets. So they're being priced out all the time. And it's this weird situation where we've said it a lot in the podcast, whereas Irish people apparently live in a rich country, but they don't feel it.
Absolutely.
And it's this cleavage between assets and incomes. Pedro, it's great to see you. Great to talk to you. That was wonderful. Fantastic stuff.
Thank you very much.
Did you ever get into the fado music? Traditional Portuguese singing?
Lamenting, sadness, sorrow.
Yes.
John, I can see you in Alentejo. Okay.
Some of it is lovely, but there's only so much you can listen to because really it does bring you down.
But it is that thing, that the slightly melancholic air of Portuguese people. It's really different to the buzzers across the border.
But it was interesting what Pedro was saying, though, like the parallels between Ireland and Portugal are quite
Absolutely.
Obvious.
Yeah, what he was saying there about, Portuguese, no problem packing their bags and going, no problem at all. They're kind of, the Portuguese are at home in the world. That's the interesting thing.
Yeah.
They're very, very good travelers. But you're absolutely right. The parallels in terms of the young people leaving, but also, John, that concluding bit there, which is, as asset prices rise,
yes,
young people get squeezed out.
Yeah.
And it's compounded in Portugal by the fact that asset prices are being driven up by wealthy foreigners coming in, not just, big business people moving over there, but actually after the pandemic, lots of young Irish people went to live in Lisbon, and that pushed up rents too. And these are worldwide problems.
But it's interesting, though, what Pedro was saying also was that politically, the Portuguese are naturally left-leaning. So this kind of whole disparity growing now between the haves and have-nots, the asset owners and the young, is going to lead to, I would imagine, quite a bit of tension.
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're left-leaning and they're experimental. I mean, these are the people who have experimented with legalizing drugs across the board, and it's worked, from what I gather. Yes, they are left-leaning, and as you said, nothing throws the gauntlet down to the left more than inequality and unequal access to housing, unequal access to all the good stuff that Lisbon has to offer.
Yeah.
But it is fascinating to hear him say that he thinks, and it's interesting, that globalization is a slog. And I think that in Ireland, if we didn't have the multinationals, right? Because the Portuguese don't have them, right? We would also think that globalization is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And he was also making the point there, if you're not able to devalue your currency after a shock, all the adjustment comes on the real side of the economy, which is wages and unemployment. And their wages are only back to 2007 levels now, whereas Irish wages are miles ahead because of the multinationals.
Yeah.
So I think we should never underestimate the power of the multinationals to have transformed the Irish economic story, because Portugal is a country that started more or less the same level as us. Salazar was a dictator, but an isolationist. There's echoes of De Valera there. De Valera wasn't a dictator, so obviously, but it's like Catholic, ourselves alone, look inside, don't take any influences from outside. That was the story of Ireland for 70 years.
Yeah, yeah.
And we've managed to turn it around, and they're finding it difficult. So we should never underestimate the achievement.